Hey everybody, Professor Snart here, checking in as we move into the next unit, but really continue our focus on modernism. So we look now at the figure, more specifically of T.S. Eliot, who is kind of the quintessential modernist in many ways. So a discussion of modernism and of T.S. Eliot are often kind of woven together. A lot of what we understand about modernism really derives from his work as a poet or dramatist. But also as a critic. So he was one of those interesting figures who was a lot of different things. So biographically, he played it really smart and was born American, but then became a British subject, so that he gets to be in both the American lit class and the Brit lit class. Pretty clever, right? But a little more seriously, he did kind of divide his time almost equally in some ways between producing creative work, most of it poetry, but also drama. But he spent, an equal amount of time as a critic, so reviewing other people's work, sort of formulating ideas about the critical process, about what poetry should be, what it should do, how it is created, and what its relationship to the poet should be. And he published lots of essays along these lines. So he had an interesting kind of foot in both of those places as the producer of poetry, but also a critic of poetic ideas as well. And so, again, a lot of what we understand about modernism, we can find examples of in his poetic work, but we can also find sort of theories about in the more theoretical or the critical work as well. And so we actually look at a nice combination of both of those things for our Eliot unit, Unit 12 here. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, probably his most famous and read work. An essay of his called Tradition and the Individual Talent. And the title, despite the slightly anachronistic prose style that he writes in, which is just a product of the time, the title is actually fairly explicit and self-explanatory. In this essay, he's interested about the tradition in terms of the Western literary tradition, and then the individual talent, or just the individual artist. What is that individual's relationship to this long literary tradition before him or before her? So that's the question that he's interested in. In exploring that question, he also touches on ideals about what the poet should be, what poetry should be, in terms of, again, its relationship through allusion or reference to the literary tradition, what the job of the reader is then, and even, and most interestingly for our purposes here, the kind of this idea he develops about sort of how poetry works or where it comes from. So even though a figure like Eliot and someone like Wordsworth, for example, are very different in fundamental ways, and the Romantic and the Modernist period are very different in some ways, they are both very similar figures in as much as both Wordsworth and Eliot obviously wrote their own poetry, but were also very concerned as critics or as theorists of poetry to elaborate on theories of creativity, of what poetry should be and how it should interact with the reader, how it stems from or comes from the creative mind. So they touched on a lot of very similar subjects, even if they came to very different conclusions. And I've always liked this particular example that you'll see show up in the discussion board question here. I'm having you read, again, Tradition and the Individual Talent, paying attention specifically to Eliot's idea of the sort of poetic mind, the creative mind. And then there just so happened to be, thank God for YouTube that collects all this stuff for us, this contemporary ad for Hewlett-Packard that features Gwen Stefani from No Doubt, where, she herself she didn't write the ad, of course, so it's not like she's really saying this exactly, but she endorses this idea of the creative process that is so similar to Eliot's. It was kind of shocking the first time I saw it, and again, thank goodness that I could find it on YouTube, because otherwise you're just watching TV, it's there and it's gone. And so I don't know what her particular background is relative to T.S. Eliot, but I can almost guarantee that somebody involved with whatever advertising firm was hired by HP to put together this campaign. Somebody somewhere was familiar with Eliot, and even if it wasn't a sort of conscious thing, someone at a meeting said, we should do something about T.S. Eliot. I can almost guarantee that somebody had that, interestingly enough, that sort of history of having studied Eliot and thought about the creative process and was influenced by Eliot's ideas. So even if Eliot's name was never mentioned specifically, I wouldn't be surprised that he was lurking in the background somewhere for somebody sort of subconsciously or unconsciously a little bit, or maybe quite consciously, I don't know. But anyway, you'll see the connection here, and it's pretty interesting. It really makes Eliot's ideas, it gives them a new life, which is actually another part of this unit that I'm having you look at, which is something that I just love to do anyway. It's in the lecture notes and context here. I particularly am interested in what's sort of generally called the history of ideas, but even more specifically, not just how an idea reoccurs, although that's pretty cool too, but how a particular like text or line or specific poem or work of art kind of gets reconfigured in vastly different time periods, decades apart, sometimes hundreds of years apart, and in such radically different contexts, but fundamentally it expresses the same, basic sort of idea or emotion or interaction with the world, or just whatever it happens to be. So there's a fascinating example, well, I hope, that I provided here that sort of begins with Eliot, moves us to Apocalypse Now, which is a reworking of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which Eliot himself borrowed from in one of his poems by quoting the Mystic Curse He Dead, which is one of the most famous sort of lines from Heart of Darkness. So even that, there's all of this sort of intertwined ball of connections here. And then again, moving us to the much more contemporary time period, but also contemporary medium of the video game here. And video games can be silly and stupid and sexist and irrelevant, maybe, I don't know, 50, 80% of the time, whatever. But that other percent, whatever you want to admit that it is just where some of the most fascinating storytelling, narrative, character development is going on. So I'm not a huge video game player, but I do like to be aware of kind of where literature is showing up in these strange ways. And again, you'll see the connection here. It's pretty fascinating, I hope. Okay, so I'll leave that all to you as we get into kind of a further exploration of modernism, a little bit more specifically through the figure of T.S. Eliot. If you have any questions or concerns, as usual, just be in touch with me, and I'll see everybody soon.